Welcome to the Colbycast, episode 222. Thank you for joining us. Today, Bonnie and I are joined by Dr. Daniel Kuebler, PhD biologist, stem cell researcher, author, and professor at Franciscan University. We discuss science and philosophy and how they coexist, and delve into the wonders and drama of science. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Colby homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and chief homeschooling officer for Colby Academy.
Hi Stephen, how are you?
Doing well. The summer is flying by as we're recording today.
It certainly is. And I'm not quite sure what happened to the summertime. It just went straight from school to summer, and we're about to go straight back into school from that. Anyway, okay. That's all right, though. We have lots to look forward to in our school year, and we're going to start our school year Colbycast season off visiting with Dr. Daniel Kuebler from Franciscan University of Steubenville. How are you, Dr. Kuebler? Welcome to the Colbycast.
I'm doing great. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me, Steve and Bonnie. I appreciate it.
You're most welcome. I learned of you through the Godsplaining podcast, which is one of my favorites, and have since been getting to know your work and listening to you on several other podcasts, including the Purposeful Lab podcast, which you hosted for a while with Catherine Hadro. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that. But before I get too far ahead of myself, as is my proclivity to do, would you tell us a bit about yourself and your background, your areas of focus and interest, and so forth?
Yeah, no, great. I am a cell biologist by trade, so I've got a degree, a PhD in molecular and cell biology. And at Franciscan, I teach courses in cell biology. I have a research lab that looks at adult stem cells from human bone marrow and fat. That's sort of what my research projects are. But I also teach a course in evolution and science and faith. So I'm really interested and have always been at the intersection between science and the bigger questions. So the questions that come up during science classes that, a lot of times I say, oh, we're going off track, but I like going off track to address some of those bigger issues, particularly around evolution. In my background, I went to Catholic University as an undergraduate. And I bounced around for the first 2 years, switching majors, going from politics to accounting to physics, and then finally settled on English. And I was taking courses thinking I was going to go to med school. And a professor invited me to come work in his lab my senior year, and I loved it. And then he said, hey, why don't you apply for a master's in biology here? And he helped me get in because I didn't have all the prereqs because I was an English major. But I fell in love with biology and got my master's there, then went on to get my PhD, and then worked for the government for a year. It didn't agree with me. And I found the job here at Franciscan, and I've been here for, I believe I'm starting my 23rd year here. So I've been here way longer than it seems. I really enjoy it here. It's a great group of students. It's a great environment for exploring the truth. So I'm really blessed to be here. And I'm also grateful, thinking about that I did get an English degree because, I really think, in interacting with a lot of scientists, higher education becomes so hyper-focused that you go in and all you do is take science classes. There's no core classes. I was blessed to take, I had to take 4 philosophy courses as an undergraduate. And that, I don't remember all the details, but it did start to teach me to think and to analyze things in a way that, allowed me to write better, to think better. And so as my kids go off to college, and a lot of them end up in the science track, I encourage them to get a double major to make sure here at Franciscan, my daughter's starting here this fall. We have a great books program, so she's going to do math and a great books program. So she's doing both and. I really think it's a both and situation for a lot of kids. And so I think that makes them so much better in life in general. They can sort of think through issues and be better citizens and better Catholics that way. So I just, I love that. The fact that I've got that education background and hadn't just dove right into the sciences,
I find that to be a really valuable thing myself. I have a a strange background in a liberal arts degree from Thomas Aquinas College, and then I have a civil engineering degree, and I still have my professional engineering license. But in today's world, it's just to me, it's such a benefit to have both experienced, the classics and philosophy, and to delve deep into classical education, but then also mine not as deep as yours, but some understanding of the modern scientific world and what thoughts are being talked about and what are some of their origins and things like that. But it's really beneficial.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think that, the modern scientific mindset, there's a lot of underlying philosophical assumptions that they have they don't even realize a lot of times, and they can't even articulate them. And so it opens up windows to explore things with people. I found that in grad school when I was at Berkeley, being able to ask questions to people who weren't Christian, what made them think. And I didn't have to ask them explicitly Christian questions. You could ask them sort of deeper philosophical, well, how do you explain this? And then they get them thinking about things that they hadn't thought of before, and vice versa. So
I think that's with modern science and how deep, as you were talking about, how deep it goes, and it's so hard because, people from the outside, it's like, well, where did that come from? Well, the scientists say that's what it is. It's like, okay, I have to trust them because I don't have the knowledge or the time to actually follow the arguments necessarily even, but certainly when it's research based, I mean, I just have to trust that the experiment actually did and said what the scientists say. So it's so deep that way, but I don't think about kind of the opposite direction, that because you're going so deep this way into the science, you can't spend a whole lot of time on the early origins and the first steps usually, unless you're going to be very deliberate about it.
yeah, no, exactly. That's that's the problem. There's so much knowledge out there to be well-rounded. But I'm saying back in the Middle Ages that was just part and parcel because they didn't have to go as deep in terms of all the details, and everybody that was educated. Not everybody, most people weren't, but the people that were educated very, very broadly, and there's a benefit certainly to that. Just it gets harder and harder as disciplines get more and more specialized today, and that's one of the benefits I think being here at Franciscan, that I've really enjoyed, is the size of the place. Is like, a lot of big schools, the biology department, you would never even talk to the biochemistry department. That would be a bridge too far. And here, I bump into theologians, philosophers, literature professors, and we'll have conversations, and I'll learn from them, quite a bit, where I wouldn't have that opportunity. So there's that ongoing dialogue you have with colleagues. I wish I could have more because we all get busy with our grading and our other stuff. But it is a lot. Not only is it small, but it also, people that have that Catholic mindset, that there's this unity of knowledge, right? That all disciplines are converging on the same truth. You have a respect for other disciplines and you want to learn from other disciplines because you realize that it can help enlighten questions in your own discipline. So you have both that mindset amongst the faculty here, and then having a smaller faculty, of 130 faculty instead of 130 in the biology department at some of these bigger universities. It's easier to have these interesting discussions and dialogue.
Yeah, I'm eager to learn more about Franciscan. It's one of Colby's college partners, and Colby and Franciscan have some dual credit opportunities that they work together on such things. So that's something more to explore in future episodes. And I think the Colby website has some information about that we'll track down and put in our show notes. I really like hearing the value that you place on your English background, how you came to that in the first place from your various dabblings in the other majors of your undergrad years, and landing on English and the value you still have for it. Did you find transitioning to biology, how did that go, basically?
No, I think it was easy for me because I think my brain is more, mathematical, scientific than it is literature and English, and I think that's what sort of I enjoyed English, because it was a challenge. It was more challenging to me, and I realized that I had to put more effort into that. And whereas math and biology came more naturally to me than the other. But it was more, particularly courses, a little more time intensive because you're in labs so much. So
Mhm.
yeah, I just really, fell in love with working in the lab and exploring questions. And when you would get an experiment that would actually give you some interesting information that seemed useful, it's a, it's a really, even if it's a minor project, it's just a very um, uh, wonderful feeling to think, oh, I found or discovered something that nobody else has really understood before. And there's something humbling and edifying in that all at the same time. It's one of those nirvana moments that scientists just, it keeps you going through the 9 months where no experiment works, and then you get some data, because it requires a lot of patience. I'm not the most patient person, but it's discovering something new about the natural world is always sort of the what keeps scientists going.
There's something just very interesting about studying the physical world. So, my education started out largely in that Aristotle, St. Thomas, very much the philosophical, and I guess uh, Pope Benedict the 16th, before he was Pope, was talking about like truth is being sort of thing, where
Yeah.
you're looking at these kind of absolute things, or even studying geometry where everything's perfect. There's no matter involved.
Yeah.
There's no stuff. So it's just, shape or ideas. The development of physics was more what I was focused on rather than biology. But just to see how, at some point there ends up being a break with Newton and Galileo and such, where they kind of separate the two. They're no longer kind of connected. I guess, yeah, Pope Benedict would have called that truth is what should be, building models and predicting. But the things that they discover when you start studying the physical world is just incredible. Things you never would have expected, going in with a theory, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, in mine, like, well, light is both a wave and a particle. How can that happen? Or I've seen some of your things about evolution, some of your talks about that, and showing like, oh, well, this, RNA attaches in a spot, and all of a sudden new proteins are formed, and where did that come from? Sort of thing. It's incredible to see how much more complex things are than what you'd expect.
Yeah, and biology particularly, I think you are engaging with something that has a mind of its own. And when you're trying to understand how a cell works, as we're, in my lab, we look at a specific type of stem cell from bone marrow and fat, and they're so variable from person to person. And it's hard to repeat the experiment because the cells do things and they have a sort of a teleology and end that they want to do, and it doesn't always agree with what you want. And it's hard to control things for a living organism. And so working with something that, you've got to try to manage, but you can't fully control. That's sort of what, anytime as a biologist, when you're looking at living organisms, it's very, very messy. And so, which is I think interesting because of the fact that life has sort of a goal and a direction of its own, and we're trying to discover that and sometimes like medically manage that and so forth. But working with something that's real, that's one of the things that attracted me when I was doing my master's. I took a couple English literature master's courses, and I was thinking, well, maybe I get a master's in English, maybe I'll switch, because I enjoyed that. But I think what really made the decision for me is I just really enjoyed working with my hands. I enjoyed being in the lab and touching something, and that was what drew me into deeper and deeper into biology as opposed to English. And nothing against English. I love English, but that for me that was essential. And I like going into the lab, a stressful day. When I go into the lab, there's usually less stress. There's something that's sort of a haven in a sense.
So you're really experienced. It's one of the things, again, when we're dealing with high schoolers and things. Sometimes our textbooks at the high school level can make make science seem very neat and tidy. The good ones kind of warn you that it's not like this really, but because you're just getting an introduction, they're telling you the things, but it's great to be in that experience where you're seeing, oh no, it's not this simple, it's not this tidy, it's we're doing our best here, trying to keep these things in.
Yeah, that's right. People think, modern science, people think it's this monolithic list of things that we know, and that we're demonstrated, we're sure of all these things. And in reality, science is just a tool, right? And it's a human tool that can address certain questions very, very well. But it's limited, just like every other human tool. And so it requires a lot of reflection and to make sense of all the data, So most scientific theories, right? They're theories, they're not facts, they're theories because they're people trying to understand all of the data of science. Right? And there's always new data that comes in. We realize, okay, that data we had wrong is data. So you're always evaluating that. And so that's where it gets messy, but that's what makes science interesting. And so the sooner I can get my students to read scientific papers, the better off they are, and I'll guide them through in my classes rather than just going through the textbook. Let's read this paper about this experiment. Okay, what's wrong with this experiment? What can they conclude? What can't they conclude? What experiment will you do next? What's the limitation here? And most scientists are honest. They list those things in the discussion, so the students they see like, okay, get them to the front edge of science so they can see what it really is, and then I think it should, for most scientists, give you more humility about the conclusions that you make. That most of the things that we think now are probably not fully correct. Okay, they're not fully wrong, but they're not fully correct. There's a number of so just in sort of stem cell biology, for example, when I was in grad school, people assumed that cells only went in one direction. They went from stem cells and then they became more and more specialized and then became like skin cells. They could only go from unspecialized to specialized, that one direction. And, about 12 years ago, people were able to, and now people do this all the time, they take adult cells and drive them back and turn them back into stem cells. So they can go both ways. And it seems that there's possibly some cells that do that naturally and might become cancerous. So that now the cell, so these things that we thought they only go in one direction, we learned no, they can go both directions. So we weren't necessarily wrong. We were limited in what we knew, and those things happen all the time in science, and that usually, to me, it gives me a pause for humility and to recognize that when we ask a scientist to give their opinion on something or on public policy and so forth, we recognize that they don't have sort of the gospel of what we should do. They're giving us the best estimate based on their view of the science. And just like every other discipline, because it's a human discipline, science is influenced by biases, pride, egos, rivalries, and all that. You go back and look at the history of science. You read Galileo, my gosh, he was like knee deep in rivalries with other scientists at the time, and he was one of the best polemic writers ever. So that's nothing new. That's just part and parcel of being human, and it's not like science is immune to it. We try to make science objective, but we can't make anything objective because we're human, and we always bring our views and biases, and I do too, to what we're doing.
I remember reading a book by that Albert Einstein wrote with Leopold Infeld, and it was kind of a book for the common people called The Evolution of Physics for most people. So no, not sciencey, but he was taking through the evolution up to relativity and quantum mechanics, and he kept talking about these clues, and I always liked it because it was spelled CLEW in the book, which always kind of stood out to me. But just like
Nice.
you're going along doing science, but things just don't work quite the way you think they should given your model. And
Right.
he refers to those being not like frustrations or things you want to squash, but these are clues that there's something wrong. So like, I mean, with relativity, it seems like that's more of a dramatic, earth-shattering sort of discovery where you throw out things that you thought were impossible to throw out, initially. But even just small tweaks, you're constantly noticing, well, okay, that doesn't work with the theory. So what's going on? That. that we don't understand yet. It's really fun.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what to me makes science exciting. I know a lot of people say science is just memorizing facts, and say, well, every discipline you have to memorize certain facts. If you want to be a good philosopher, you need to memorize, just sort of, what does Aquinas teach about form and matter? There's certain things you have to memorize. But what's interesting is, okay, well, once you have those facts, how do you explain them, and how do you predict other things or answer new questions? And maybe there might be more facts that you have to know in biology to get to that stage than you do maybe in other disciplines. I don't know, but doing a discipline is getting to that point where you're asking scientific questions, like in philosophy, when you're asking philosophical questions and trying to come up with answers. That's when you're learning philosophy, really, right? And when you're asking scientific questions, that's when you're actually learning biology. I think, and that's when it gets exciting and interesting, and that's what I think would bring more kids into science. I think it's one of the problems with science education is they just sort of memorize a bunch of facts and they have some cookie cutter lab that they're bored with, rather than just having them either, have some inspire wonder in them just by observing living organisms and just sort of observing them and then asking them questions that we don't know the answer to, where they start to think, well, maybe it's this. Well, how would you do it? You don't have to have them do the experiment. You just have them think about, well, maybe I do this to try to figure that. And that creativity that comes out of it, I think, is what really, makes scientists. And so, those are the type of things that I think if you have a kid that you think, oh, they got a scientific bent and you're homeschooling them, you don't need that, like necessarily another book or something, but just sort of have them contemplate and ask scientific questions with them and get them thinking about it. And I think that's what inspires them to want to go into science.
I think there's this fundamental misunderstanding about what knowledge is that just kind of infects everything. Obviously, I see it with even, classical schools. I mean, because you're aiming for knowledge and most perfectly, usually you want to know things from their causes, right? I mean, if you can in some
Right.
way, but there's not a high school student that I know of that's prepared to do biology, actually, to know biology from its causes, or physics or chemistry. So those courses at that level are what we kind of call prelections at times here and at Kuebler. It's a preparation. You're saying, here's what people say about this, but you don't know yet. You need to go and ask those questions. You need to go and figure out what these theories are based upon to really get the knowledge of those things. And we do the same with philosophy and things in high school as well, because sometimes we're throwing people into the 5 ways, the proofs of the existence of God before they've studied any Aristotle really whatsoever. And so then, yeah, you can memorize what he says, but you can't understand the philosophy just like you can't understand some of the science in fullness.
Yeah, that's so true. And I just think that you really want in those courses to get them to be able to think as quickly as possible about interesting questions, realizing that they're not going to think properly necessarily, but once they start, and often when they make a mistake, that oh, okay, maybe I have to think about it this way, and yeah, I just think it's much better, particularly, as I tell my students, if all you do in this class is learn a bunch of facts, then you've wasted your education. So,
Yeah.
I want you to be able to think critically about them and how to organize them and what's missing and what do we need to know next and that type of thing. And, but a lot of students that I do are going on into medicine, and medicine is such an art form because there isn't always a playbook of what you do, and you have to think critically. You have to take into account the patient, who they are, what their background is, and it doesn't always work, the medication you prescribe, and you have to sort of think on new ground with each patient often. So wanting students to have that idea that it's not just look it up, here it is, there it goes, and that's all I need to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Boy, talk about adding complexity there. I mean, go from the complexity like you were talking about in the lab to then here's a person with all sorts of stuff going on, not a controlled environment at all when it comes to medicine.
Exactly. That's, yeah.
Well, bringing in the faith dimension, would you talk to us a bit about the relationship between science and the Catholic Church?
Yeah, no, this is something that, I think our modern society thinks it has this idea that science and faith are sort of juxtaposed, that you either have. I think it's waning now. I think it was much stronger maybe 15, 20 years ago. There was a lot of atheist writers who were very popular, like Hitchens and Dawkins and so forth, that were really the resurgence of this. I've noticed it's waning, but the idea that, there's faith and superstition on one side, and then there's science with pure knowledge on the other side, right? And the history of science and the church, it couldn't be any more different than that sort of juxtaposition, right? And that's one of the things that I like to stress with my students. And the second, and I'll go over that in a second, but the second is this idea that science and faith are juxtaposed is really, in the modern day, is really, it's not science versus faith. It's just two different sort of moral ethical frameworks that are actually arguing back and forth. That's really what it is. It's not science versus faith at all. But they frame it that way because it often gives them more cachet. It makes their argument seem a little bit stronger. But one of the things that I like to talk about my science and faith course is sort of the birth of modern science, right? And so why did science, emerge in its present form in the West, right? And a lot of it had to do, there's many factors. So you can't pin it down to one, but one of the major factors is because of the Catholic Church and because of the Catholic faith, right? So you have science in some form in the ancient Greeks, probably in the Romans, then the Islamic world in the 7th, 8th, 9th century. But science really takes on this sort of systemized, well-financed, sort of independent, in a sense, that enterprise that's trying to understand the world, in the Christian West, starting in the Middle Ages, and part of that is because the church recognized a couple things, right? So first, you got to have money and resources to have people be full-time scientists. So you have to have a relatively stable society and so forth, so that that's required. But you also have to have a belief that science is valuable and nature is worth studying, and that nature is ordered, right? If I think nature is just chaotic, there's no reason for me to study science, because I'm not going to detect any patterns. It's just a bunch of chaos. And if I don't think nature is, valuable, right? Then maybe there's nothing to gain from there. And from the Catholic Church, we always recognize that the natural world, the book of nature reveals the creator, right? And so there's this idea that if I study nature, I am going to learn something about creation, and therefore that reflects upon the order and majesty of the creator. And because the creator is rational, this is something that Benedict stresses. At the beginning was reason, right? That reason is at the beginning of all things, and it underlies nature. So nature is going to be reasonable. So therefore, if I study it, I should be able to detect some patterns there, and I should be able to make some sense of it, right? Those are really, that's part and parcel of Catholic understanding of the natural world, and that motivated a lot of early Catholics, Franciscans, Jesuits, to really become scientists, right? And that the church was the largest supporter of scientific research, or has been in over the course of history. And so science really comes out of that, the sort of the modern science, at least, it emerges in this Christian context. And I don't think it's a chance that just because of happenstance. I think there was something there that fueled that, and it has continued to support science and be interested in science up to the present day. the Vatican, still has its observatory, and still have the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. They're interested in science because they realize, well, science is going to reveal truth about the world that's not going to conflict with the truth that we learn from theology and philosophy and from Revelation, right? It's both and, the book of Scripture and the book of nature, and the two are pointing in the same direction. Now, I think nowadays, a lot of times the church sort of, and very rightly so, draws lines about what is ethical and moral uses of science, okay? Or what are ethical and moral ways of doing scientific experiments, right? And so when someone says, let's take, embryonic stem cell research, right? So the church says we should not kill embryos to extract their cells to do research, right? And people say, well, it's science versus faith. And it's like, well, no, what that is two different ethical, moral boundaries. So this person is saying it's ethical to do that. The church is saying it's not ethical to do that, right? And has an argument for that. And the argument is really where you draw that ethical and moral boundary. And everybody has it, even the atheists do. And so I always, say, well, what, even the most committed atheists would say, Nazi experiments where they took prisoners and dumped them into freezing water to see how long the human body could sustain itself. Are those ethical experiments? And I think they would. Almost everybody says no, right? And I said, should you get informed consent before you inject people with things? And almost everybody said yes. And I said, well, I could do a better experiment. If I didn't do informed consent, if people didn't know I was experimenting on them, the data might actually be cleaner because there'd be no placebo effect and so forth. So you're hindering science by requiring informed consent. So you're anti-science. So I can make that case. The point is everybody draws an ethical moral boundary. And just because the church has a line where it's drawn, that's different than the line some other people do. That's not science versus faith. That's just an ethical arguments that we're having. And the church is all for scientific advancement if it's done in a way that respects human life and leads to real human flourishing, right? And that's so again, the question is an ethical one and a moral one about what is human flourishing, right? And human flourishing would be diminished if we use humans in a utilitarian way to benefit other humans, right? And so that's what we said, that's not going to lead to overall human flourishing. So that's just sort of my take on the science and faith thing, is that it's really a misnomer. There isn't this conflict between science and faith in history or even in the present day, and people are hard pressed, other than the Galileo episode, which was extremely complicated and a lot of other factors was going on, to find another case where the church came down on a scientific theory. For the most part, the church has stayed out of scientific debates. It's been interested in them and supported people working on them. And it's been interested in sort of the philosophical implications of certain scientific theories, but it has stayed out of saying, well, that scientific theory is false, right? It doesn't do that. And you can't find an instance where it's done that other than with Galileo. And there's a lot of other caveats going on as well.
Yes. Very complex.
Yeah.
But it's I think people kind of I like that thing about the ethical background, because like the two things that stand out to me are always Galileo, or that shift from the geocentric to heliocentric sort of things, and then of course evolution, which I know you've talked about. But I think for one, when we're removed from a decision, which like the heliocentric, geocentric, I mean that changed everything. Like if you say all of a sudden the Earth is spinning around the sun, well, for thousands and thousands of years, the principles people were used to were heavy things go downward, light things go up. How can this big rock be spinning around, some eternal body? You've got to change everything. So there's some inertia, I think. But also, I think you see the opposing forces to the church are also using them as like, haha, we found something that's true. This means the church is wrong. And the church is saying like, okay, we've got to square this away. And evolution seems to be that sort of thing where it's like, okay, here's evidence. And we had always thought man was just created right from dust and instantly new man creation. But then the other thing is, no, man is no different than a monkey or a fish or anything like that. So there's these people are using the science kind of to support their own ethical sorts of things. Well, the church is trying to square it away, but the opposing forces sometimes are using it as an attack against the church when really we're just trying to figure out what's true, right?
Right. Yeah. No, and evolution is a great example of that, where, the church has not come out and said evolution is false, evolution is true. And again, that's not what the church is going to do. It's not the church's job to come in and just to rule on what are purely scientific theories, right? But what the church has done and what it has been very clear on, from Humani Generis to the present day. Humani Generis in 1950 was the first time the church officially mentioned evolution or talked about it. And what has been very clear on is that any theory of evolution that becomes philosophical in nature, and Steve, this gets to your point, that says man is nothing more than a material being, right, is not a scientific theory, is a philosophical theory, and the church is going to condemn those because those philosophical theories are wrong. They don't convey the truth about man, right? And that's where the church, starts to get into this, oh, it's science against faith. Well, no, it's scientists taking a scientific theory, adding on a philosophical claim that isn't directly borne out by the science and saying it is, and then arguing that evolution demonstrates X, where X is a philosophical point. And that's where the church jumps in, and rightly so. And Pope Benedict, Pope John Paul II, Pope Francis, have all made that clear. Every pope since Humani Generis has made that clear. And this is one of the things, like you said, it's a major difference in the way people thought about organisms, about humans, just like a big difference between, the geocentric and heliocentric system. And it takes a while to think those things through. The church is still thinking those through. Well, what would that mean? What does that mean for humans? So what does that mean in terms of how the human person came to be, right? And for me, I think the best, there's a lot of unanswered questions, even scientifically. There's a lot of unanswered questions. But I think the evidence, for common descent is relatively strong, right? That humans are related to, in some way, to other primates. But how do you get that and wrap your mind around that with what we know is true about man, about original sin, and all these things from faith. And I think Benedict, the way he frames it in the book in the beginning is one of the best frameworks. It doesn't answer all the questions, but that framework that, there's that evolution and creation are not two opposing things, but they are two ways of viewing, of understanding reality at two different levels, right? And he talks about the creation story, or the Catholic understanding of creation, tells us what human beings are, right? We're made in the image and likeness of God. We are, we're a unity of body and spirit, right? We're made to be with him in eternity. These are the things, and we're dependent upon him for our existence. Like creation means that we wouldn't be here. Nothing would be here without God allowing things to exist. He's the cause of all existence. And then evolution, on there, it doesn't answer those questions. It answers, well, how did the physical changes come about that might bring about the type of form that is fitting to be a rational creature, right? That's the thing. And so you can say, and I can say, 100%, yes, we were created immediately by God, right? And at the same time, we evolved. Both of those things can be true because both would, in my view, both would have to happen, right? So evolution can only explain so much. It cannot and never will be able to explain the totality of the human person, because the human person is more than a material being. And science, evolution, if it is to be a scientific theory, right, must restrict itself to explaining material things, physical things, right? And there is something about humans that it goes beyond the physical, that is immaterial. And this is something certainly the church teaches, but it's something, there's many agnostic philosophers who argue this, who argue that there is no way that matter alone can explain human consciousness or our ability to reflect on ourselves. There's something else that has to be explained. So there's good philosophical arguments that have nothing to do with theology that people make on this. So it's not like the church is out in left field on this one. But we believe, and I think there's good cause to believe that we're more than material beings. And if that's the case, so that there's this immaterial soul that brings about our immaterial mind and our ability to have thoughts and reflections in a way that animals don't, right? And that is something that is created immediately by God. So the first human, however that came to be, had to have been created immediately by God, whether it was via an evolutionary process, no matter whatever process it was. And so I think interesting when you think about it that way, it isn't as different as it might have been. People might assume it to be, right? And that's how Benedict frames it, I think, in the beginning. And then I think that gives space to people to be, okay, well, then there's nothing really that evolution can do that's going to threaten my faith. And then you can evaluate the data, the fossil record and so forth. So I think in a sort of a clear conscience, not saying, well, it has to show this because it will undermine my faith if it shows anything different, or it has to show this and so forth. And so it clears the way to allow science to be science. That's one of the things I've heard Bishop Barron talk about with science at a Catholic university about, what makes science different at a Catholic university, and what makes it different is not the way you do science and so forth, like the scientific method and so forth, but it's how you reflect upon that science. But he says, just go do the best science that you can. That's the Catholic way. Do the best science that you can, and then think about it in relation to everything, the wisdom of the church, right? That's it's a both and. So you do the best science that you can, and then think about it in the wisdom of the church, and you have nothing to fear. And there can be contradictions, or as Benedict points out, there can be apparent contradictions, right? And these apparent contradictions require humility. So, well, yeah, it's not sure how these things fit together. So either I don't know my science correctly, the science is, we're missing something scientifically, or we don't fully understand some aspect of Catholic theology. It's not like it's wrong, but we just don't fully understand it. Like there's something that hasn't a sort of a greater understanding that's coming, right? And we have this confidence of the unity of knowledge that they're not going to be irreconcilable, even when there are apparent contradictions.
Yeah, I'm seeing, or I keep thinking as you're talking here about the benefit of being in the church is that, I mean, you talked about the, knowing that there's a value in seeing, but it's also provides some targets, like you're saying, because like through the faith, we can, again, Aristotle came to the understanding that man had an eternal soul because he could reason, he had an intellect, and so he didn't know what was going to happen once you lose the bodies. Like, I don't know how this is going to work. You don't have an imagination, you don't have these physical things, but I know it's eternal. So something's going to happen. But the church provides these guidances, like the fall, as you can mentioned in passing, like when it comes to evolution, that's like the things like, okay, we have to have a fall because there's no reason to redeem man if there isn't a fall of some kind. So it necessitates this sort of thing. So it's like, well, okay, how is that going to work with what science is presenting is what's true? But we have both some targets. I think it gives us some targets as well as providing us with that comfort of you pursue what's true and it's going to be good. As long as you push aside, like you were saying with scientists, the pride, the agendas that you might have, look for what's true, the world's going to become more clear and more understandable, and you're going to come to an understanding of the creator as well. So I think it's just good.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's perfect. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I mean, it's just human that scientists, often, want to be the first to discover something or want to have a place of pride or so forth, and then that can lead them to, not even an evolution, but just to cling to a certain idea longer than they should because it was their idea.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's just human nature, right? And so it's something that infects every discipline, not just science. So.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to like you were saying, if you were to go back and write some of the, you could write very juicy sort of stories about those scientists, like the Bernoulli family. There was some, and I think there was even like Tycho Brahe and Kepler. There were some rumors that maybe Kepler had assassinated Tycho Brahe's mentor. I mean, there's just such drama at that time to get the next level, get the next big discovery.
Yes, yes, and then that hasn't gone away, and you see that, even now among scientists, being the first person to, to clone a mammal, or the first person to find, life on another planet. So there's, certain things like, oh, if I do this, my reputation is made forever, and so they'll try to bend the data. Yeah, it's interesting. There's a papers about like the oldest life in rocks, and there's some signs of life in rocks that are like 3.8 billion years old. And there's one lab group that's like, these are signs of life, they definitely are, and another group that says no, they're not. But the other group has found life, signs of life in like a meteor, right? And so they argue, well, this is, but then the other group says no, it's not. And so they go back and forth, but they're sort of defending sort of what their place of priority, you see, and the evidence is ambiguous in both cases. I know it's hard to tell, right? But people are convinced because they want to be the first to demonstrate X or Y. Yeah.
People. Well, so in the beginning is among the texts used in Colby's biology course. So I wanted to include that. You mentioned that, and happy to throw that out there for folks who don't know that about the Colby biology course. And you have a book coming out published by Word on Fire. Is it already out or is it forthcoming? Where does that stand?
Yeah, it's forthcoming. So it's finished now. I'm just going through the edits, but it's going to come out next year in 2025. And
Okay.
I think the tentative title is Darwin and Doctrine, Evolution, Compatibility of Evolution and Catholicism. So it's a book. It's geared towards a general audience that wants to understand how might you reconcile an understanding of evolution with sort of the Catholic Church and the Catholic teaching on human origins and original sin. So it's more of a way of sort of looking at these issues that can be helpful for people that know that have left the faith because of science. I think it would be beneficial for them to think about things. So there's a chapter there on sort of the history of evolution in the church. There's a chapter on original sin. How might that be worked out? How do people think about that? A chapter on human origins. There's a chapter on sort of how do you understand evolution from a Thomistic perspective, right? There are certain Thomistic philosophers say evolution is impossible. You have others that say no, you can integrate that into Thomistic philosophy. So there's a chapter that sort of looks at that. There's a chapter that looks at the immense order and patterns underneath evolution. So evolution is not just this chance free for all, but there's an inherent order in the natural world, in the physics, the way the world is structured, that actually, in my opinion, and in the view of a lot of people, is directs evolution in certain directions. So it's not like there's just, oh, anything goes. There's certain structures that fall out of the physics and chemistry. And proteins that make us up are one example of that. There's very limited number of proteins that of three-dimensional protein structures that we find. And that's largely because of the underlying physics and chemistry. So the idea is if you reran evolution again, you would still get the same proteins same structures, because of the underlying chemistry and physics. So you have this order there. We live in an ordered world. We can't explain it, just is, right? And that order sort of dictates and directs evolution, which is, I think, a very interesting and richer way of looking at evolution than sort of often what people think of it as. So, but yeah, that book should be out in 2025. So.
That sounds great. We'll have to keep an eye out for that and you keep us posted on that. Uh, the way I came to become acquainted with you, as I said, was through the Godsplaining podcast, which then led to me finding the Purposeful Lab podcast. Would you tell us a bit about that podcast, the Purposeful Lab, and kind of how you came to be involved in that and so forth.
Yeah, the Purposeful Lab. So it was a project. We had a Templeton grant. Joe Miller, who was at the Spitzer Magis Center, he got a grant, and it was mainly to use social media and videos to get people to think about alternatives to the idea that science is demonstrating that man is just a material being, that science is pulling people away from faith, that science can resonate with a theological understanding. So how do we, have, talks and videos that might get people to think that no, the more you understand science, the closer you can get to God rather than the other way around, right? We made some videos. So there's a Purposeful Universe webpage that has some videos. And about a year and a half ago, we decided to do a podcast in the last year of the grant. So Catherine Hadro from EWTN News and I were the co-hosts of that, and we had philosophers, physicists, biologists, art historians, and we just sort of looked at sort of the purpose that you find, sort of the order and that you find in the universe, and how that sort of works its way up into humans and what it is to flourish as a human person. We finished that grant, so the podcasts are all out there, but we're transitioning. Franciscan University is going to continue that with me, because we don't have that much money. So we'll probably have Catherine as a guest occasionally, but we're going to continue that Purposeful Lab podcast with a similar thing. So I think our first series, we're going to look at man and woman. What does that mean? Like, look at that from a biological perspective, a medical perspective, a philosophical perspective, a theological perspective. So looking at these bigger issues from a diverse range of perspectives. So we'll be doing that and start filming that and have that out by the end of the year, I think.
That's great. I was excited to find that podcast. And I think I caught the last episode when you were talking about it being the end. I was like, oh, wait, it's ending. But then I reframed it, as Dr. Majors teaches us to do. And I realized that I had several seasons to go back and start from the beginning. And I had a lot to get through before I hit the end of that, and the hope of more to come soonish. I'm not all the way through it yet. I have found it very interesting and helpful. And I think it would be a great companion resource for our Kolbe families, parents, and high school students to listen to kind of augment their Kolbe studies and so forth. As I've been preparing for this episode, I've found you as a guest on other podcasts outside of the Catholic conversation with Protestant hosts, so forth. I didn't even realize it until I got pretty far into the conversation, and I just admire that greatly, that you're able to converse with a wide range of folks. Do you have any other resources or recommendations for us, or any words of wisdom to convey to aspiring scientists?
Yeah. Well, I guess this would work for both. I am the vice president of the Society of Catholic Scientists. So it's an international organization founded by Stephen Barr, who's the president. And we have a website that has, a number of articles. There's probably maybe 20 articles up there now on science and faith topics, all kinds of interesting things about what happens. It's funny, Steve, you mentioned that what happens to the body after you die. What would heaven look like from a physical perspective? But talks about evolution, talks about what the limits of neuroscience and explaining the brain. So there's a lot of interesting articles there. There's videos from our conferences. People that are, either interested in these questions or thinking of careers in science, that's a great place to go. And we have an annual meeting, and we encourage, college students to come. We have student membership, and can help fund them to come to those meetings. But it's a great resource, and you get to know other Catholic scientists to support you and to mentor you as you go through, school and think about a career in science. So that's a great resource for anybody that's interested in science or has a kid they think is heading in that direction.
That sounds great. We'll need a link for that for our show notes, so we'll have that for folks. We visited with some of our Kolbe science faculty on a few episodes, so I'll have links to that, links to the Magis Center page that is the landing spot for the Purposeful Lab podcast. We were blessed to have Father Spitzer speak to our Kolbe students a few years ago at one of our awesome. Called Holiness Retreats, and I think everyone greatly enjoyed that and appreciated him doing that and so forth. So our show notes, as usual, have a bunch of stuff, so we'll send folks there. Anything before we wrap up that we didn't get to?
No, I think that's great. I really enjoyed the conversation with you guys, and best of luck to you. I'm glad you're doing this, and best of luck to all the Colby homeschoolers. I'm awed by you and doing that. And it's a great education for your kids, and so keep up that great work. And because I've seen a lot of students from Colby homeschools families at Franciscan, and I've been impressed by what you do and what they know and how prepared they are. So
Good deal.
God bless
Thank you.
your work.
Thank you very much. And likewise, we wish you all the best and a good school year to come. And all the things you're working on, we'll be keeping an eye out for that. Hope you'll keep in touch. And we really appreciate you coming to visit with us today, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks.
Subscribe to the Colby Cast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@colby.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Ignatius of Loyola, holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam.